Good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted to see all of you here. We're going to start the webinar. It is 3 p.m. Central Time. Thank you for joining the REL Southwest today for the Bridge Event webinar, The Data Informed District, Research and How Educators Use Data to Inform Practice. Our presenter today is Dr. Jeffrey C. Wayman. Before we get started with the webinar, let me briefly share with you background information about the Regional Educational Laboratory Program in REL Southwest. My name is Jackie Bernisky, and I serve as the lead for Dissemination and Collaboration, or TASK 5 and 6, for the REL Southwest. Many of you have logged in recently, and I want to give a technical assistance tip, and that is if you have called in using the conference call system, and so you do not hear feedback between your computer and the phone, please select the arrow to the right of the speaker icon and then select Mute Conference Audio Only. Thank you. Here is a map of the United States showing you the Regional Educational Laboratory Program. If you're not familiar with the program, there are 10 regional educational laboratories across the country. The Southwest region is indicated in orange and serves Texas and the surrounding states. We are very excited that today we have participants from all across the country and the world, and not only from our region, the Southwest. In fact, in our registration, there were over 180 registrants from 42 states and 4 countries. There are currently 84 participants on the webinar. In addition, you can look at the map and see which regional educational laboratory represents you and serves your region. The short name for the Regional Educational Laboratory Program is the REL. The REL program is designed to partner with school districts, with state departments of education, policymakers, and other people who are interested in the work of the Regional Laboratory Program. This work is to conduct research and build the capacity in our region to use data in order to improve academic outcomes for students served by the schools in our region. As you can see here, this is a contract with the Institute of Education Sciences, or IES, at the U.S. Department of Education, which is the funding source that sponsors the Bridge events. So at the REL Southwest, you can see our goal to improve academic outcomes for students. And that is the goal of the other laboratories as well. We do that by helping states and school districts to use research and data to answer important questions of policy and practice. We also have 6 research alliances that we work with in the region. They are our partners in conducting all of this research. One of the primary ideas behind this REL contract is that researchers will partner with practitioners so that the research that is conducted will be relevant to practitioners and that we can bridge the gap between research and practice. So by partnering with the research alliances, we provide technical assistance that's related to selecting, analyzing, and interpreting data and evidence around questions that the research alliances have about particular problems with practice. So it is our alliance members who provide the direction and the focus of what the research will be. Another way that we connect the education researchers with practitioners is through events such as this one, which we call Bridge Events, because they are intended to bridge research and practice. So here you can see listed our 6 research alliances in the REL Southwest. Today you're going to meet Janice. She will be helping us with this webinar. She is our liaison for the 2 research alliances focused on pre-kindergarten education, and one of those is in Arkansas and the other one in New Mexico. We also have a research alliance in Louisiana focused on charter schools. There is a second research alliance in New Mexico that focuses on the achievement gap among Hispanic and Native American students. We have the Oklahoma Rural Schools Research Alliance, and finally the Texas Hispanic STEM Research Alliance, which is focused on pathways for Hispanic students from kindergarten all the way through college and into careers in the STEM disciplines. So next I want to just share with you an image of our REL Southwest website. You can find information about the services that we offer through our website, including the Ask REL Southwest, where folks from our region are invited to ask a question related to research, and there's a form from our website. You can fill that out And we'll do our best to answer that question or refer you to someone who can help you. So I mentioned our 6 research alliances. If you go to that area of our website, you'll be able to see all of our members and the folks that we work with in each of those research alliances. We have links to resources organized by Research Alliance and states with many data resources as well as research and reports. We also have a bulletin that we send out electronically called the Southwest Spotlight. Many of you have already subscribed to that when you registered for our webinar, and if you haven't done so, we invite you to do that. The Bridge event today will eventually be on our website in our archived events. So if you want to go back and refresh your memory about the information that Dr. Wayman will present, you're welcome to do that on our website. Our URL is relsouthwest.cetl.org. Well, that's our brief introduction about the REL Southwest and the Regional Educational Laboratory Program. So now I'm going to just do quickly an overview of our webinar features and norms. Many of you just joined us. A lot of you already heard this when you joined early, but I will go through this quickly. So I think most of you have already located the speaker icon and used the arrow to mute conference audio only if you have called into the webinar. And you are all muted, so we do use the chat pods to hear from you and not the telephone. So many of you have introduced yourselves and you know how to use the chat pod, so we invite you to continue to do that. There is the technical assistance chat pod, and then you have posted information in the examples and insights chat pod, and you have introduced yourself, which we appreciate. And then there is going to be a question chat pod available later in the webinar. You will notice a transition throughout the webinar as we switch layout. For example, when Dr. Wayman is speaking, we will have his PowerPoint presentation up, and you'll see a different layout. We are going to show a video, and then we will have a stakeholder feedback survey where you will be able to select the link and complete the survey to give us your feedback. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the REL Southwest website and available for anyone to access. So again, thank you for joining us today. And this is the goal for our Data Use Bridge event, which many of you saw when you registered for the Bridge event, and that is why you're here. It's to present and examine research describing the components, roadblocks, and facilitators for using data to improve district, school, and classroom practice. And this is our agenda for today. We've done the overview. We're going to hear after a short video from Dr. Wayman, and we're going to have some questions and discussion facilitated by Dr. Shanna Shaw, who is our REL Southwest researcher, and Janice Kaiser, who is the Research Alliance Liaison for the Arkansas and New Mexico Pre-Kindergarten Research Alliances. Again, we welcome you this afternoon, and I'm turning the webinar over to Shanna.
Thanks, Jackie. As Jackie said, before we move into Dr. Wayman's presentation, we're going to show a short video from the Doing What Works series. It's called Using Student Achievement Data to Support Instructional Decision Making. And it's important to point out that this video illustrates an interesting example of data use at the classroom level, which is distinct from Dr. Wayman's focus at the district level. But both the video and Dr. Wayman's talk today focus on data use for instructional improvement.
My name is Renati Gaddy. I am a 7th and 8th grade language arts teacher at Shotwell Middle School in Houston, Texas, as part of Aldine Independent School District. The data analysis booklets are a tool that was developed by our department head, Barbara Dixon, to help us assist the students in tracking their progress as they go throughout the year, taking the benchmark exams and the other standardized exams, to help the students determine what they need help with and how they can improve not only their scores, but their logic behind their decision-making when they choose certain answers. The students always start by looking at what answers they got right and what answers they got wrong. They're supposed to write down the question that they got wrong, write down the answer choices that were available to them, and write down the answer that they chose. And then after that, the students are expected to write down why they chose the answer that they chose, what their rationale was. In some classrooms, they'll go a step further in the booklets and write down how they're going to improve for the next exam. The data analysis booklets also allows students to see exactly what areas that they have concerns in. When they go back and they look at their exam, with the teacher's guidance, of course, and they notice, oh, I missed questions 2, 5, and 7, those are all mood and tone questions, they'll put that in their data analysis booklet, and then they'll have a better understanding of the fact that maybe they're deficient in that area, and they know that that's what they in particular need to focus on. They're also required to go back, write down why they missed those answers, which is the most valuable piece, I think, because they really have to be cognizant of why they're making the mistakes they're making. Initially, students weren't really keen on the idea of the data analysis booklets, just like we as teachers weren't really keen on having to do all of our own data analysis, because it's very overwhelming to look at a bunch of numbers or to have to track your progress and see where you were weak and where you were strong. So initially, the students weren't really keen on the idea. They said, we took the test, we're done with the test, why do we have to go back and look at this test again? But now, as they've noticed that they've improved in areas and they're seeing the growth and they're taking ownership of it, and they're noticing that the reason they're improving is because not only did they help identify their own weaknesses, but they came up with a plan, and guess what, it worked? Well, now they're really starting to enjoy looking at their data analysis booklets, working on their data analysis booklets, and then planning again for the next time that they need to work on their data analysis booklets. I think that the data analysis booklets are a wonderful tool for students beyond just learning their core content area, beyond just learning language arts or math or science, because they provide students a way to strategize how they're going to be problem solvers in the future. Because really, success is dictated by your ability to respond to failure, your ability to plan for the future, to see how you're going to correct your mistakes. So the ultimate goal here is not just to create students who perform well on tests, although that's a wonderful byproduct. The ultimate goal is to create students who are critical thinkers, who can go throughout their lives and be able to recognize their deficiencies, accept that without becoming upset or without deciding that they're not going to be motivated anymore and they're just going to give up. The ultimate goal is for them to look at their mistakes, recognize them, embrace them, and then strategize how they're going to fix them. And I think that is the best thing that we can get out of the data analysis booklets, creating productive citizens who know how to learn from their mistakes, can recognize why they made them, and then who can move on.
Okay, great. So now we'll move into Dr. Wayman's presentation. I'm pleased to introduce my friend, our webinar presenter today, Dr. Jeffrey C. Wayman. Dr. Wayman's a researcher, education consultant, and former professor with expertise in the effective use of data to improve education practice. His award-winning research includes a 3-year study from 2010 to 2012 on the implementation and effects of a data initiative in 3 Texas school districts. Dr. Wayman has authored and co-authored numerous research publications and peer-reviewed articles on the topic of data use in education. He began his career in education as a junior high math teacher before focusing on educational research. He served as a professor at the University of Texas in Austin and as an education researcher at Johns Hopkins University and Colorado State University. He holds a PhD in education and a master's degree in statistics, both from Colorado State. For his complete biography and citations of recent research, we invite you to visit the REL Southwest website. And I'll now turn it over to Dr. Wayman.
Thank you, Shanna, and thank you to everybody for tuning in on this webinar today. We've got a little less than an hour here, and I promise it'll be fun talking about data use. So I've been researching the effective use of data for over 10 years. I started, as Shanna said, when I was at Johns Hopkins University. Sam Stringfield and I were working on issues around teacher data use. I carried that research line whenever I went to the University of Texas. Served as a professor there for 8 years, where I got the chance to continue my research, but also teach classes in this area. But in May, at the end of May, I went into business for myself as an independent consultant. And so my business focuses solely on helping K-12 contexts use data. And I do this stuff full-time now. My clients are school districts, schools, and especially service providers that help K-12 organizations use data better. Before we start, I want to draw your attention to one of the website addresses there, the WaymanDataUse.com address. I should tell you that that is not quite built yet. We were almost done with it, and my web developer got this chance to go to Spain to be a visiting scholar for 3 weeks. And I didn't quite have the heart to tell him, no, don't go to Spain, build my website instead. So if you go there, it's got a link to where you can see what most of what the content is going to be on that website. But check back often. We should have this built out by the end of the year, and I intend this to be a resource for information about this. One of the things is you're going to be able to access everything I've ever written on data use. And I expect to put a lot of other resources up there too, so check back often. So let's talk about the things that we're going to do today. Before we get into the main content, I want to get some preliminary stuff out of the way. I want to get us on the same page about some things, some definitions, and what I mean by the data-informed district. After that, we'll go to the main part of today's talk, which is to talk about various components of the data-informed district. So the first thing that we need to take care of is to define what we mean by data today. Now, when we think of data, we often think about and are told about assessments, particularly state assessments, but formative assessments, local assessments. These are the formal assessments that are fairly new on the educational scene. But in today's talk, we're going to take a very broad view of data. Yes, we will talk about assessments. We do mean assessments when we mean data, but we mean so much more. We mean grades, quizzes. We mean parental information. We mean free lunch information. We mean work samples of kids. Anything you can think of that helps an educator know more about kids is going to be considered data. The second definition I want to get out of the way is the purpose that we're going to use data, or that we're going to do our data use. This is an important thing, and if you read articles or hear people talk about it, you almost never hear them say, well, here is the purpose that I'm talking about. And it turns out, as you can see on this slide, there are a lot of different purposes for data, and how you talk about how that's used really depends on the purpose. And so I advocate that anytime somebody's talking about data, they have to say data use for what? And for today, our data use for what answer is instructional improvement. So instructional improvement is going to be the focus of our data use talk today. So let's talk now a little bit about what I mean by the data-informed district. My interest in data use, where my heart is how teachers use data. That's every piece of research that I do always funnels down to how will the classroom teacher use this. And when Sam Stringfield and I first started talking about this, it's how we framed it. It wasn't long as we were doing our research on teacher data use that I came to the realization that if we were going to help teachers use data throughout a district, that we were going to need systemic support. And so while it's important to talk about the nuts and bolts of how teachers use data, we will not realize any sort of comprehensive teacher data use unless we get system level support. So as I transitioned from Johns Hopkins to the University of Texas, I was starting to work on this framework that I call the data-informed district. And what I've been looking at for the last few years is ways that districts can be set up to support teachers in making instructional improvement that is data supported. So let's talk a little bit about that. In the data-informed district, alignment is a key thing, so that when you walk into the elementary school on the east side of town, you see people using data in at least a recognizable way to what you saw in the high school on the north end of town. Integration is a big thing in the data-informed district. Collaboration, you'll hear me talk much more about later on, is a big tenet of the data-informed district. One of the things that's so important in the data-informed district is that data are used in the course of everyday work, not in addition to everyday work. So we're we're using data as part of our natural work days, much the same as you use information in your everyday life. What this means is we aren't asking teachers to use data on their lunch hour. We aren't asking them to use it on Saturday or after school. We ask them to use data as it supports their work. A data culture is important in the data-informed district, but my research shows that that you do this through structures, processes, and practices. You set those up, and then you develop your culture. Finally, before we launch into the main content, I want to note this, that data don't drive anything. We hear the phrase data-driven decision-making, and it's not data that's driving the decision-making, it's professional judgment. Data is merely a support for the professional judgment that teachers and principals and central office workers and superintendents use every day. So, we are on the same page about some things now. Let's talk about the rest of our talk today. We're going to talk about 5 components of the data-informed district. You can see them there: common understandings, collaboration, data systems, professional learning, and principal leadership. And for each one of these components, we're going to have 2 slides. We're going to have a slide that talks about what the research says, and then we're going to have a slide that examines roadblocks and facilitators. So, the first thing, and I should also say that, that every now and then we're going to stop with some questions that people are submitting. So Janice is going to break in and ask a question every now and then. Yay. So ask yourself this, in terms of common understandings. How many times in your education career have you had a discussion with a colleague or a group of colleagues or with an entire school or unit about what you mean by teaching and learning? I promise you it hasn't happened often, if it's happened at all. And one of the big things that research tells us about data use is that we have to get straight what we mean by teaching and learning and data use. Now, I want to stress that I'm not talking necessarily come to agreement on all definitions. I think that is probably unattainable. Instead, I'm talking about what Senge calls shared mental models. We need to talk about what we mean by teaching and learning. We need to know what that is so that we can know how data serves that. And while we may not agree exactly, if we're all talking about this, and if I understand your mental model about teaching and learning, and you understand mine, we find ways to fit this together. Now, as we do this, it's remembering that we aren't coming to lockstep definitions. We find out that it's the process that it's important. Just the mere process of engaging in these conversations makes us all better, makes us closer to a similar mind in this. Still, you have to write this stuff down. When you come to understandings, if you are fortunate enough to make some definitions, you write it down because this last bullet is true, that understandings are organic. We know this from all the research. Your understandings change as you grow as an educator, as your school grows, as you get better at data use, and so you have to write those things down. What gets in the way of common understandings? Well, one thing is that people assume that common understandings exist. In every district that we've ever evaluated for data use, we have the same result, which is that when we give a survey and we ask about common understandings, are there common definitions for data use in your district, overwhelmingly or unanimously, that is the highest ranked scale on our survey. Then when we get to talking to people in focus groups, we say, well, what's your definition of teaching and learning? And we get things that are all over the board. So the survey is saying, yes, we all have common understandings. The interviews are saying, what? You mean you don't understand like I did? Turns out we've never talked about it. And I just thought we had common understandings because I thought everybody thought like me. And it turns out everybody has their own thoughts. So when these common understandings are assumed, that's a roadblock. Also, it is hard sometimes to get people to do this upfront work about common understandings because they feel that there are bigger fires to put out. Trust me, this upfront work is your number one fire, and it makes the other fires burn much more cool. Things that make this work, in our work, in our district evaluations, we've talked about a process that we call calibration. Calibration exercises are things that relate to your everyday work that that help you exchange these mental models and help you get on the same page about what we mean by teaching and learning and data use. I mean, it's an interesting thing that we've done. We've said as a nation that we're going to measure teaching and learning. We haven't defined that. I don't know what teaching and learning is. I know I'm going to measure it, but I don't know what it is. And so it's this odd conundrum we put ourselves in. And as I mentioned, then you have to make these calibration exercises relevant to their work.
Dr. Wayman, could you give us some examples of what calibration might mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll give you an example from a workshop we did in one district where they asked us to do some calibration exercises. They were working on common assessments, and they were trying to understand what the role of common assessments should play in their school or in their district. So what we did is we organized principals and administrative teams, and we actually conducted a calibration workshop where they went through a 40-minute series of questions about discussing, okay, what do we see as learning for a student, and if we see that as important, how will we know that learning when we see it? Like what products, what measurements, and all this, okay? So they talk about these things, and they talk about, well, how can we create common assessments that support this? How do our common assessments that we already have support this? They took that information back to their schools. They each conducted these exercises in their own schools. They pulled it together as a district, and they got a lot of good information. Doug Reeves talks about the adult science fair, where adults or where school level teams do projects based on data, and then they share them out in a gymnasium, like a science fair. Things like that can be calibration exercises.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So let's move on to the next one then. Let's talk about collaboration. Collaboration is such a huge benefit for data use because collaboration is where you reflect together. It's where teachers get together and chew on this information. It's where we kick things back and forth ideas. It's where we get to say in front of people that are safe, I don't know how to do this data thing. It's so important. But as you might guess now, it works best when it's based on common understandings. Because if the aim of calibration is to do this stuff together and get better and reflect together, then we have to be on some sort of same page about how we're going to do education. The research tells us that collaboration doesn't happen well unless it's structured. And certainly we've seen across the nation schools moving much more towards creating structured time for their educators to use data. Here's a funny thing. As hard as it is to structure time within the school day to collaborate, that's the easy part. I say that facetiously. What I really mean is that even more important is that you have to structure what goes on in that collaboration. Because we've seen over and over again where we have time structured for collaboration, you throw a group in and say, here, collaborate around data, and it's hard to get going. And oftentimes things don't get done. So you have to structure what goes on within that collaboration too. The research on knowledge management tells us that your collaboration is going to be more creative if you can mix some unfamiliar roles. So if you put the usual suspects together to collaborate, they're going to come up with the usual ideas. And so we advocate mixing it up a little bit. Finally, I'll say that no matter how important we think collaboration is, it's more important. So we come out of this webinar today going, wow, this is more important than I ever thought it was. And tomorrow it's even more important. It is just huge. So let's talk about some roadblocks and facilitators to collaboration. One of the roadblocks is that the school has no structures. And while I see more of this happening in schools where there's more structure, I still see way too much of it, where teachers are expected to find time to do this on their own. Another roadblock is that common understandings are lacking. I remember when I was a junior high teacher, they asked me, the math teacher, and the English teacher to get together and align our lessons. And they just said, go do it. And that conversation lasted approximately 2 minutes and 15 seconds because we didn't have really any common understandings of how English and math were going to mix. And we each had papers to grade, and it just didn't last long as much as we liked each other. So I'll say that those are roadblocks. Facilitators, you can make collaboration happen and happen well if you build structures in that fit their work. pretty much anything you do around data use has got to fit the work that they're doing today so that they can make this useful tomorrow. And you can find out how they're working, and you can build these structures into their work. Last, I'll say that that you can do this by engaging in calibration activities too. The calibration that I mentioned before, you can build a calibration activity that deals with common understandings and collaboration at the same time, and while also dealing with their everyday work. And in one sense, the educator never knows that they were actually doing anything different, because they're only doing things that they needed to do anyway.
What suggestions do you have to encourage those who resist collaboration and resist using data?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting part, I'll speak first to teachers. Teachers are the most resistant group to using data, and rightfully so. I mean, historically, every time the word data has come into the conversation, it hasn't been good for us teachers. It's one of the phrases that I like to say is we're trying to help teachers use data, not be used by data. And historically, we've been used by data. But I will say that teachers are also my easiest sell. All I have to do is start talking about ways that this is going to help you know more about your students, help you do your practice, and that's why you got into education in the first place, and it's an easier sell. So now I'll expand it from teachers to administrators and many other stakeholders that resist data. I think if you can set up an environment where this is focused on the work, where this is focused around something that you were going to come to work today and do anyway, if you can provide structures and if you can provide supports, I have never seen that fail. Maybe it has someplace, but I've never seen the proper supports, the proper focus on work, and the proper structures fail to win over a fair amount of the resistors. So let's move on and talk about data systems. The truth is that you can't do this unless you have a good computer system. Now, I had it said to me once, and this is true, that if you can't do this with pencil and paper, you probably can't do it with a computer system either, and I agree with that. But I know that if all you've got is pencil and paper or a few Excel spreadsheets, that this is too difficult to do in any sort of scalable fashion. You might be able to create pockets of people who are interested enough to go ahead and put in this work, interested enough to learn it all, but you can't get school-wide or district-wide data use. You can't make it a part of everyday life without an effective data system. So you should aim to have this technology in front of your educators. And one way to do that is with integrated data systems. Integrated data systems are things that can create a one-stop shop for teachers and put all of the data from these other disparate data systems at their fingertips in one place. And there's no reason that the student information system carrying absences shouldn't be able to communicate with the system where you're doing your interim assessments, and shouldn't be able to communicate with the gradebook and put all these in one place. And in fact, we've gotten pretty good at that the last 5 to 10 years. There are a lot of vendors, private vendors, a lot of the service providers have built their own. And Barbara Means and her group at SRI did a study that showed that almost every school in the nation now has some sort of data system. And I would argue that quite a bit of these are integrated now. We still need more, but quite a bit of them are integrated. A second point is that data systems should support education practice. So it's not just the technology that we need to get. We need to look at how our educators are working and find a system that fits that. Because if I have to change my practice to fit the data system, guess what loses? It's the data system. It's unreasonable to ask somebody to change their practice to go around a data system, because the data system is going to change someday, and I'm going to have to change my practice again. What this third bullet is telling us is that the technology part is by and large solved. We can move the data pretty well, and we can integrate the data pretty well. The human part is not yet solved. Vincent Cho and I are getting ready to publish a study that we did that looks at how educators make sense of their data systems. And that's a big part about fitting the data system to their work, is finding out how an educator makes sense of them, what they see when they see a data system. One of the things that we find in this study is that the educators' notions about data are what totally drive what they see in their data system. We have a great example in there where 2 different districts had the same data system, and the educators saw those systems completely differently because their notions about data were completely different in those two districts. Finally, I'll say that I believe that most districts are missing the boat on how we train about data systems. I advocate that we train for data use. I think we don't ever train on the data system. I don't think we train, okay, you get on here and you click this and you click this. I think instead that we do, like we presented to one district, a system or a training method where you train on the properties of the data. You get some problems that they have to work on the data themselves, something that fits with their everyday work. And somewhere along there you say, oh, by the way, here are the steps you need to access the data in our brand new data system. You do this enough and you breed users who are familiar with the data system but never once trained on the data system. Think about it. How many of you got training on your smartphone? Right? No, we didn't get training on the smartphone. We got it and we started using it, and every time we needed to know how to do something, we asked. That's how you train on a data system. So you train for the use and not the system. Let's go to roadblocks here. I could probably pick a million roadblocks and facilitators for data systems. One of them is that data systems don't have what educators want. Teachers in particular have a short fuse for this because teachers are always overrun with their time. And so if I as a teacher sit down in front of a data system that doesn't have what I want, I'm going to get up pretty quickly, and odds are I'm not coming back. User hostile data systems are a problem. I heard Rich Collada from the Department of Education say one time that if we gave, if Amazon functioned like education data, if we gave people information about their Amazon book orders like we gave in education, it would be, okay, you bought this book. Other people who bought this book are represented in this spreadsheet here that you can download and look across this grid and find out all the books that they wanted to buy, and it's just insane. So if your data system is not user friendly, it is a roadblock. Facilitators, user-friendly data systems are important. Look, my mom can do so much on the computer and has not had any training. A data system ought to be easy enough to where somebody like my mom should be able to sit down. If you can check the weather, if you can go on Amazon, if you can do all these other things, you ought to be able to use a data system. And finally, I'll stress again, this is about the work. This is not about the data system. The data system supports the work. So many districts buy a data system and they say, okay, what will this system let us do? And when the opposite should actually be true. We are going to work like this. Now let's go buy a data system that fits it. So let's move on to professional learning. Surprisingly, there is not a lot of research out there about data-related professional learning. There's a lot of research around professional learning itself. But JoBeth Jimerson and I are getting ready to publish 2 articles at the first of next year on data-related professional learning. And what we found is not too surprising to you, I'm sure, that data-related professional learning has to be immediately useful. It's also not surprising to you, I'm sure, that we found that most of it isn't immediately useful. We found that it has to be, it doesn't have to be, but it is most effective usually in smaller settings. It's not that you can't deliver good data-related professional learning in a large-scale setting, you know, in some sort of sit-and-get setting. It's just that most of the time you can't, because most of the time it's not relevant to everybody in the audience. On the other hand, data-related professional learning can be delivered in collaborative time. There's nothing says that we have to do it in these big, large-scale events. If a teacher team is working, like I was talking about with the aforementioned common assessments, then there's no reason why you can't send somebody in there for 5 or 10 minutes and deliver a little bit of professional learning on that. There's no reason why you can't do that a couple or 3 times a month and help these folks out in that collaborative time. That brings us to another thing, which is important to remember, which is that typically, I'd say the last 10 years, most of the data use expertise has resided in schools that have a few experts, you know, a go-to person and all that. That's nice, but we advocate building we advocate building expertise, not experts. It's nice to have a go-to person, but when that person leaves or when that person's not available, then you're restricted. On the other hand, building expertise is a capacity building exercise. And if you can build expertise throughout your school, then you're a lot more flexible. And it speaks to the last point there, that if you think about your school as a learning organization, not just a series of people who show up and teach and close their door and go into the principal's office and do all that stuff. If you look at your organization as a learning organization, then when I have built some expertise as a faculty member, I'm able to share that to the organization and everybody gets better, and we don't reinvent the wheel. So the individual learns, the organization learns, and vice versa.
Dr. Raymond, we have a question about professional learning. What should teachers be expected to know about analyzing, understanding, and using data to make instructional decisions?
Could you repeat that, please?
Sure.
Sorry.
What should teachers be expected to know about analyzing, understanding, and using data to make instructional decisions?
Well, fortunately, we've gotten off the notion that teachers need to be these advanced statisticians. I've been working at this 10 years, and I have a master's degree in statistics, so I'm a stat geek. I like stats, right? I have yet to recommend to any teacher that they need to do a t-test or an ANOVA or any of these other stat things. So luckily, we've moved away from these very complicated things that people aren't interested in. I think what teachers need to know are they need to have a certain amount of data literacy. So they need to know properties of data. They need to know what they can do with data and what they can't. You know, whether you can average percentiles, you can't, and things like that. They need to know these as they relate to their everyday work. But beyond that knowledge, beyond the knowledge that they need to be competent in using data, they need more knowledge about how to turn data into information. They need knowledge about how to collaborate with each other, to make changes in practice. They need knowledge about how to talk to their students about data. And so I argue that a lot of the things that teachers need to know about data use goes on top of just the properties of the data. A lot of these techniques that we're talking about are every bit as important as their properties of data knowledge.
Thank you.
So let's talk about some of these roadblocks and facilitators to professional learning. Everybody on this webinar has felt this first one, the long time lag between learning and application. It's the end of May, I'm done with my school year, and I'm going to get a professional development session on state test results, which aren't going to show back up in my inbox until September. And so I get it in May, and in September I'm like, did I go do that? That is a roadblock. We don't expect our students to do that. We don't teach our students that way. I don't know why we teach teachers that way. In an associated way, when anything isn't tailored to your immediate need, you aren't going to remember it. And we see this happening all the time with professional development. In fact, one of these studies that Joe Beff and I did shows that we asked teachers what they thought they needed. And they said the things that we saw on the first slide. You know, I need it immediately relevant. I need it small. I need it useful. We asked the people delivering professional development at the district level, what do you think teachers need? They said the exact same thing. They needed to be useful. They needed to be immediately relevant. They needed to be in small settings. Then we saw what they did. And what they were getting delivered was things that weren't useful, that were not immediately relevant, and not in small settings. They were in big, large-scale settings. And so these things that we tell educators to do about professional learning are really easy for me to sit here and say on a webinar. But there's a reality out there that I don't yet quite understand that makes it hard for us to set these up in the right way, even when we know what we should be doing. Because it wasn't that these folks didn't know what they needed to be doing. And so this is something that the field needs to address. couple of ways around some of those is if you're somebody who's delivering professional learning opportunities, go find out what your educators need. Find out what they're talking about. Bug the teacher's lounge. Do something to find out what the content is that can be used tomorrow and deliver that. The other thing, I'll tell you, if you can't teach it within everyday work, see if you can find another way. I stop short of saying forget about it because I know there are realities of school budgets and state mandates and stuff that we have to deal with, but it's got to be within their everyday work. So let's move to our last pair of slides, which is principal leadership. I say this for last for a reason. It's because of this first bullet. Data use lives and dies in the principal's office. All these other things are important, and they are super important, and you're not going to do well without them. But if you don't have your principal on board, if your principal isn't a good leader for data use, you're going to have trouble getting full faculty involvement. Again, you will have a few unusually interested people that might get into it, but without good principal leadership, you just can't make it work. Here's the problem. As we've prepared principals historically, we haven't included data use. I used to teach a class on principal leadership for this, and I can tell you the principals are out there in the same boat as the teachers were. None of us going through our preparation programs had this stuff. And imagine what that's like as a leader to be sitting there with the same amount of knowledge as everybody else, yet you're trying to present yourself as a leader and somebody who's leading these folks. In doing it, we put our principals in an unreasonably hard situation, and I think it's offensive. Turns out there are strategies that the principals can employ that help them lead faculty. We wrote a conference paper about this last year, and I'm putting the finishing touches on sending it into a journal, and so the conference paper itself is a little rough, but it'll be up on my website soon, that outlines 12 strategies that we found that principals can learn to lead their faculty in using data. We've got a few of them listed here. I didn't list all 12 mainly because it's bad form to list 12 on a PowerPoint slide. But you can see a few of them here. If a principal would learn to facilitate collaboration better, that will help their faculty use data. Principal learns about structuring time. That will help. If a principal learns how to engage in some of these calibration exercises to foster common understandings, that will help. The thing is that these strategies are actually fairly easily employed, and I believe we would see a big difference if we saw more districts asking their principals to learn these strategies. I'll say that I also think it's more important for a principal to know how to lead their faculty than it is to be able to use the data itself. I'm not saying it's not important for a principal to be a good data user, but so many courses and workshops for principals deal with just the data. And I'm telling you, it's not just the data, it's leading your faculty. You got somewhere between 20 and 70 people who need to be led in this, and so these strategies are important. Let's look at the roadblocks and facilitators for principal leadership. One of the roadblocks that we've seen a lot in our research is a principal separating data use from daily practice. And I can see that. It's a lot easier to set up a data day or set up a workshop to use data than it is to try to put it into everyday practice. Similarly, we've seen a lot of principals focusing mostly on state tests. Okay, I want to say I get this, right? Because how are our principals judged? By state tests. Okay, so if I'm a principal, that's job one. I like my job. I like not getting fired. And yes, I'm going to make sure that my state test scores are as good as they can be. But when that's the only focus, that's a roadblock. It leaves a bad taste in your faculty's mouths. It is distracting from the overall work of education. And there's no reason why you can't have state tests, as Renata said in that video. There's no reason why you can't have state tests be a good product, a good byproduct of education, of good overall educational data use. Facilitators, job one, help your principals. admit it. Your principals need help. This is nothing to be ashamed of. But I don't see districts moving to give their principals the kind of help and support that they need. We've given recommendations to 5 separate districts on how they can create a data-informed district, and in each recommendation, it said, you've got to help your principals use strategies. And I'm sorry to say that none of the 5 districts took them on the level of detail that we recommended. You can do this. Even if you did just one new strategy per year, even if you just had a principal, ask every principal, pick one of these 12. Tell us which one you want to work on. Let's work on it this year. You will be ahead. I know this will work.
One more question for you related to principal leadership specifically. What are the implications of data-driven reform on principal and leadership preparation programs?
That's a good question. I can tell you this, it's not happening. Ellen Mandenack has done some good work looking at principal preparation programs and the lack of data use training that's out there for principals. The class that I taught at the University of Texas, I don't know if they're teaching it anymore. I know I'm not. But the class that I taught at the time was one of the few that was in the nation that was focusing on leadership. I think there are a lot of classes for principals that focus on data itself, but I don't see a rush from the professional leadership organizations, from principal preparation programs. I don't see the rush to train principals for this. A lot of these things are still 20th century models, and that's not our reality today. I'm afraid the principal preparation programs aren't moving with the field. And so I think it's pretty easy to step up. I think the implication for principal preparation programs is that they need to say, okay, we are going to either offer a course in database leadership and just make it part of our curriculum like it was when I was at the University of Texas, or I think, better yet, the principal preparation programs need to say every course that we teach is going to have a leadership component about data use. That's what I actually want to see happen. That one I really have not been successful on, but it would work. So that is pretty much all I had planned to say today. For me, this is an ongoing conversation, and I am always interested in hearing what people think. I'm interested in answering questions. I'm interested in having more discussions. And so there are 3 ways here to contact me. You can shoot me an email. My website, Guy will get back from Spain, and we will get that built out. Also, I have a page on Facebook where we have some data use conversations too, so you can visit that. You can tweet at me. I forgot to put my Twitter handle up here, but that's @WaymanDataUse. So send me a tweet. I'd love to hear from you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Wayman. We really appreciate your presentation today, and we do have a few more questions. We're wondering, I'm going to do some concluding comments, and then I'm wondering if you would be willing to answer a few more questions, maybe beyond the 4 o'clock time frame.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and move the PowerPoint forward, and we do appreciate all of our participants joining us today, and as we just mentioned, Dr. Wayman did say he will stay on and answer some questions, and we do invite you to complete our stakeholder feedback survey, and you can see there is a pod in the webinar, and you browse to that. You select Browse To, and the website with the stakeholder feedback survey will show up for you to complete immediately. So we do invite you to do that, and again, we're delighted that you joined us, and please keep typing in your questions, but I think Dr. Wayman has received quite a few questions, and we'll be ready to answer those momentarily.
Great. So this is Shanna, I'll be monitoring the questions as they come in, but I thought we'd go ahead and kick it off with our first question. How do educators share data with parents?
This is kind of cool. I feel like Casey Kasem. With
Yes, very interviewee.
a listener in Kalamazoo asks, how do we share data with parents? Is that the question?
Mm-hmm.
That's an excellent question. This is low-hanging fruit for educators and education organizations. I'll give you a few answers to this. One is pretty much an umbrella answer of tell your story or someone else will. And I'll give you an example of this. We did an evaluation of a district and how they use data. We found in this community that there were a bunch of organizations that were publishing educational data. There was a parent group, there was a real estate organization, I don't remember which other ones there were, but I know the organization that was not publishing education data was the school district. And so there were other people out there telling the story, and we told them, we said, get out in front of this. You know, you can, I mean, you're teachers, right? That's your job as an educational organization. You can teach the community what you want them to know out of your data. And so we really recommend that districts are transparent with their data and they're public with the way that they present data and that they do it often. I don't commonly see it, but I think that's an important thing. So that's one answer. Another answer I have is for teachers, and that's a twofold answer. One is that data are a really, really powerful tool with communicating with parents if you haven't just made them a bunch of numbers that make everybody glaze over. If you can turn a little bit of data into information for your parents, it's so important. I've got young kids, and I go to parent-teacher conferences, and I like it whenever a teacher tells me, here is how your child is doing, and here is how I know. And I don't need to see just test scores. There are lots of times when the teacher will say, here is how I know because I have these observations here. That's data also, right? And so I think that's powerful. Finally, I'll say as a teacher, when you communicate with parents about data, don't be so overwhelmed by the data that you forget who you are. I saw a teacher one time communicating with parents about their child and had all these great reading diagnostics that they had done. Your child was reading at this level, complete with observational data that she had, right? This is just fantastic. Parent says, great, how's my kid doing in math? And the teacher says, we don't know because we don't have an assessment for that yet. And I wanted to jump out and say, actually I was in the conversation, so I was able to, I was able to interject and say, in a much kinder way, come on, you were Teacher of the Year last year. Imagine you didn't have data. What would you be telling these parents? And it was basically a head slap to the teacher going, don't forget who you are. And the teacher was like, oh, yes, right. Well, the kid does this, 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 and this. But the teacher was so wrapped up in reporting data that they forgot who they were as a teacher. And they were still able to give, here is how your child is doing in math, and here is how I know, even though I don't have a formal assessment. And the parents are like, right on. And they went home.
That's great. Great anecdote, too. Another question that's come in, what are your thoughts on whether and how data should be categorized into formative or summative for decision-making purposes?
I think, like a paper that I read by Marianne Perry and Brian Gong once, where they talked about uses of data rather than labeling the data. So I don't think that there are summative assessments. I think there are summative uses of assessments. I think that I think you can find a summative use in almost every assessment, and I think you can find a formative use in almost every assessment. I'll tell you this, every time I've ever seen a teacher use data, it's been formatively. And teachers will use state test data formatively and do it well sometimes. I think that's the best example. In fact, we have Sam and I had an article that we published in 2006 that's got this great example where we were asking a bunch of teachers, how do you use data? You know, what type of data are useful for you? And they all said, oh, we don't want this historical data. We don't want anything that's not right now. Give us what's going on right now. We don't want data that are DOA, you know, dead on arrival. We said, okay, good. Well, show us sometimes that you have used data. And the first thing they pulled out was a student history with all of their old data that were supposedly dead. And they hadn't even noticed that, that they were making wonderful formative uses of these historical data. So that was kind of a long former professorial way of saying, saying I would rather see the uses labeled than I would the assessments themselves.
Good. Okay, so our third question, there's a lot of interest in data use from, I guess, what we would call non-traditional schools, so particularly from charter schools, and some questions about whether there are special considerations for data use in charter schools.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'll start by saying that I'm not an expert in charter schools, but that's why they gave me a PhD, right? So I could talk about things that I don't know about. So I'm not an expert in charter schools, but I do know, I've dabbled a little bit in how charter schools use data. And I know this, that charter schools represent a really fertile place for data use for a couple of reasons. One is that charter schools, maybe more than public schools, have a burden to prove what they're doing, right? And there is a lot of argument back and forth in the literature and in the policy brief world about whether charter schools are working. And you can take the same data and show it both ways, right? So again, I'll tell the charter schools, tell your story or someone else will, because you know that, I mean, the charter people know that. There are other people out there telling their story. And so this is a tremendous opportunity for charter schools to really take control of their data and use it to their advantage. And the reason I think that this can happen really well in charter schools is because charter schools are a fairly new thing. And charter schools don't have to deal with 50 or 100 years of baggage that may come with other schools. And so in a certain sense, you're in a position to affect a younger culture. And I have seen a couple of charter schools that I think are just doing fantastic things. A lot of stuff that I talked about up here that research says that we should do that isn't often happening in public schools, but it can in a charter school. I'm sorry to the charter people who were looking for specific guidance on that. I know that's not specific, but if you look at the things that we talked about here and apply that to your context, I think you may be in even better position than some of the public schools to be able to do this. Can I extend that question a little bit? I also wish I knew more about rural settings and data use. Now, I should know more about that because I grew up in a rural school. But what I know is anecdotal about that. I know that through my own experience and from what I've worked with rural schools. Here's the thing with rural schools. Rural schools offer a different context because especially in the smaller ones, they know the students so much more intimately. You know, I went to high school with 200 people, and my friends ditched school one day, and by 10 o'clock, the principal came to get them. He knew where they would be. And so that's a different level of knowledge, which requires a different level of data, and I would like to study that sometime. The other thing I know about rural schools is that the data system vendors, they are completely left out of the data system world because rural schools don't represent a big enough chunk of the dollar. You know, I had a data system vendor one time lament to me that his company was on what he called the Willie Sutton model of selling to schools. Willie Sutton was a bank robber, and they asked him one time, why do you rob banks? And he said, that's where the money is. And this vendor was kind of lamenting that his company only sold to large districts because, like Willie Sutton said, that's where the money was. And some of the service centers have been successful in helping out the rural districts. Hopefully some of these state systems can help out. I know Arkansas is doing some great things with regard to that, and Oklahoma's going to try. I think, but I just think we can't forget about the rural context in this, and I hope to figure that out someday.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I know that our Oklahoma Rural Schools Research Alliance has a lot of interest in data use, and our Arkansas Alliance has a lot of interest. So thanks for that. You read my mind. So we're over time a little bit.